These stuffies were all made with the same base pattern, but when you add different elements, it can change them into completely different creatures. Here's the base head next to the full plushie. It's worked from the top down, and that way this string that's coming out of the bottom can be completely hidden inside the body of the stuffy. Start with a magic ring by wrapping the yarn around the back of your hand and then putting your hook underneath and over those two strands of yarn. Pull a loop, and then you have to wrap and pull through that to finish your magic loop. Then you do 6 single crochet stitches into the magic loop, making sure that you go underneath and around both of the strands to the left. It is a little bit awkward. You have to rearrange multiple times, but this is the best way to start off working in the round, so that way you don't have to worry about closing a hole in the end. You just pull the tail very taut and it will close up. At the end of the row, pull the tail so that way it closes the round, but don't pull it so tight so that way it completely cinches. You want to have a little bit of space so that way it's easier to get into the first stitch of your next round. After you've finished round 2, that's a good time to pull the tail completely tight and close that up. For this video, each time I go to the next row, I am working in a different colored yarn so that way you can see better what I'm doing. So each row is going to be completed in orange, and then it'll go back to green so that way the next row can be done in orange. So whatever I am doing with the orange yarn after this row is going to be what you are doing for that current row. Make sure that you count while you're going, but then also double check your number at the end by counting how many stitches you've done. When I've pulled everything tight, I still count backward from my hook to the beginning of the row, so that way I know exactly which stitch that I need to start with. Here I'm working with the orange now, and for row 2, you're going to increase each stitch, meaning you do 2 single crochet stitches into each stitch. So that way you double your number. When you do your first stitch though, you need to make sure to immediately put your stitch marker in. It'll go underneath both sides of the very first stitch that you make, so that way you know when you get back to that, it's time for the next row. So now that I've done my first single crochet, I'm going back into the same stitch for the increase. It's the exact same process. Enter the stitch, pull the loop through, wrap, and then pull through both loops. For each stitch of the previous row, you will work 2 single crochet into that stitch. Because you started the row with 6 stitches and you're doubling it, you should have 12 stitches at the end of the row. Make sure, especially for when you're working with something where you increase and decrease a lot, that you're counting how many stitches you start and end with. It's very important so that way you keep up with the pattern. Don't forget that at the end of this row is a very good time to pull the tail that you started with very tight, and that way it will cinch everything up and keep it from coming undone. For the next row, always remove your stitch marker and then start with your first stitch. This is a single crochet that begins row 3, and don't forget to immediately put that stitch marker back into your new stitch, so that way you don't forget and get halfway through your row and don't know where the initial stitch was. So that goes underneath both sides of the stitch that you just made, which should be right underneath your hook. The next stitch is an increase, so you'll make 2 single crochet stitches into the second stitch of the row. Now for the rest of the row, because this is in parentheses, you're going to repeat it as many times as it says outside of the parentheses. And in this case, it says single crochet increase around. What that means is that all the way around this row, you're going to continue the single crochet increase pattern. If you forget whether you've done a single crochet or an increase, you can always just go back and count from the beginning of the row. And what I usually do is I'll obviously count the singles. I'll count it by using the word increase because it has 2 syllables. So it'll be single crochet, increase, single crochet, increase. So here I know that I haven't done my increase yet, so then I can complete that and move on for the rest of the row. That just generally works for me, but there's no absolute right or wrong way to count it. So continue that pattern for the rest of the row, doing 1 single crochet and then an increase, and you should end up with 18 stitches at the very end of your row. Again, I always suggest that you count how many stitches you have at the end of your row before you move on to the next one. Generally, if your pattern ends at the right part, most likely you have done all the stitches correctly, but I really like to emphasize that you count all the stitches at the end of the row just to triple check. For row 4, our pattern shows 5 single crochet, increase around. So the 5 single crochet and increase are in the parentheses, and that is what we are going to repeat all the way around the row. When you make your first single crochet, again, always make sure that you immediately put your stitch marker back into that first stitch. And then the first 5 stitches of this row will be single crochet. So here we have the second single crochet, and then the third, fourth, and fifth. And after you've gone to that 5th single crochet, that is when you will do your increase. So that is the 6th stitch of the row. After that, you're just going to keep doing the same thing. 5 single crochet, then an increase. 5 single crochet, then an increase. Again, if you are ever confused as to what stitch you're on, just go back and count from the beginning. And reminder that whenever I am counting my increase stitches, I count it using the word increase, and each syllable of the word is one of the increase stitches. So I would count it as increase for those 2 stitches. For this row, we only add 3 stitches to our total stitch count. We went from 18 to 21. The more single crochet stitches that you have between increases, the fewer increased stitches you end up having. So because they're more spaced out, we didn't make as many extra stitches. For row 5, here we have a combination in the pattern. The first 5 stitches are going to be single crochet, just like the last row. Don't forget though to put your stitch marker back immediately after you do your first stitch of the row. Then you would continue to the next 4 single crochet. And then you do your increase. After that we have the parentheses where it says 4 single crochet increase around. This is the last increase row of the basic head shape. And after this we'll do a few rows of just single crochet to make the head a little bit taller, and then finish off with decrease rows to complete the sphere shape of the basic head. At the end of this row, you should have 25 stitches. If you don't have the correct amount of stitches at the end of your row and you're just 1 or maybe 2 off, it's okay to sort of flub it and just add an extra 1 or 2 increases at the end of your row. If you're off by a lot though, you really do need to pull back the whole row and then just pay very close attention while you are stitching the next time around. I often will talk either out loud or in my head, counting the numbers of stitches as I go, especially if I've been making some mistakes. That's really helpful. Row 6 is single crochet around. Make sure, as always, to put your stitch marker underneath both sides of the V of your first stitch, and then you can keep going for the rest of your row. The last row we ended with 25, and this row we will end with 25 because we aren't making any new stitches. We're just continuing the pattern to go up another row and add some height to the project. You'll notice now that it starts to make more of a bowl shape instead of staying flat, and that's really going to change when we get these 3 single crochet rows done too. These 3 rows are pretty much going to speed by because they're the same thing, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Every single stitch on this row is going to have 1 single crochet in it, no increasing, no decreasing. I do still suggest that beginners count the stitches at the end of every row, even if you aren't making any increase or decrease stitches. Row 7 is also single crochet around. As always, make sure that you put your stitch marker back immediately after your first stitch, and you will finish with your 25 stitches at the end. This row is the absolute middle of the basic head for our stuffy. And after one more row of single crochet, then we'll begin the decrease rows to close off the other end of the sphere. Row 8 is also single crochet around. Make sure to put your stitch marker in immediately after your first stitch, and then continue all the way around with single crochet again, and you should have 25 stitches at the end of your row. You should still count them even though there's no increase or decrease stitches, just to make sure you didn't skip one or accidentally add in an increase. Row 9 begins the decrease rows for finishing off the sphere. You'll be working rows 5 through 1 backwards. So instead of the sphere getting larger, it is now going to get smaller because we will take away the stitches that we increased previously. Row 9 is opposite of row 5. So first there are 5 single crochet and then a decrease. Remember that for the decrease, what you're doing is taking 2 stitches and putting them together to end up with 1 stitch. So you're taking 1 stitch away from the row. You do that by taking your hook and going up through the front loop of the next stitch and then up through the front loop of the stitch after that. So you're only grabbing the 2 front loops of the next stitches. Then you wrap and pull a loop through and wrap and pull through both loops on the hook. Make sure that you look at the top of the row, and wherever you see the next complete V is your next stitch. After that first 5 single crochet decrease, then you're going to work in the parentheses and do 4 single crochet decrease, repeating all the way around until you get to your stitch marker. So for a decrease, you're doing the same single crochet stitch itself. The only difference is that instead of going underneath both sides of the V, you'd be going up through the front loop only of the next 2 stitches. So that way they are stitched together. We've taken away 4 crochet stitches for this row, and you should end with 21 stitches. Again, I highly suggest that you count your stitches at the end of each row. Row 10 is the mirror of row 4. You're going to have 5 single crochet and then decrease that will repeat all the way around. So you're going to take away 3 stitches and end up with 18 at the end. You should notice that the rows, of course, as they get smaller, the sphere is starting to close up a little bit at a time. And if you end up not quite getting the right number at the end of these decrease rows, most likely what happens is if the hook doesn't go into the next stitch, but instead goes into that second stitch that you decreased, then you're just putting the stitch back, and that would completely defeat the point of the decrease. So if that's the kind of issue that you're having, definitely make sure that you're not going back into a decreased stitch, and instead you move to the next full stitch of the row. Row 11 is a mirror of row 3. You will single crochet and decrease around, removing 6 stitches to go from 18 to 12 at the end of the row. Make sure that you count the stitches at the end of the row to see that you have the correct amount. At this point, you should stuff the head. If you have any safety eyes that you would like to use, put them in first where they should go, and then stuff the head. Stuff your plushie firmly so that it has a little bit of give when you squeeze it, but not too much. You also don't want to overstuff it because then this will stretch the stitches out and you'll be able to see the stuffing through the fabric. Row 12 is a mirror of row 2, where instead of increasing around, we'll be decreasing around. One thing that is going to be tricky is now that it is stuffed, it's a little bit harder to get into the stitches. Especially sometimes you'll end up pulling some fluff through, and that can be a little annoying. The best thing that I find for decreasing on a plushie, especially once it's been stuffed, is to make sure that you are keeping your stitches very tight. So this is a good time if you are the kind of person that just pulls the crud out of your yarn and crochets super, super tightly. The looser that your decreased stitches are this row, then the more holes that you're going to have in your piece. Granted, this is the bottom of the head, and it will be connected inside where the body of the stuffy meets the head, but I usually just generally like to have a nice fabric all the way through. For this very last row, you're going to decrease until the hole is mostly closed, then fasten it off and sew that completely closed. The thing with this row is if you try to decrease every single stitch, it'll end up having kind of like a droplet situation going on where it'll be pointed at this end instead of flat. So I'll usually do no more than 1, maybe 2 decreases before I fasten off and then sew the opening closed. Just cut and pull that end through your last loop to tie it off. And then if it really doesn't have that big of a hole, you can just keep it and not worry about sewing that tail in. That can just go down into the body and be part of the stuffing.